The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has interacted with students at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore on the ways in which technology can change our lives. The interaction came after several memoranda of understanding were signed between India's universities and Nanyang University. Earlier, Prime Minister Modi issued a joint statement with his Singaporean counterpart. Both signed a number of memoranda in the areas of defence, space and skill development. The Indian Prime Minister and Singapore's Lee Hsien Loong held extensive bilateral talks. And on the broadcast with me right now from Singapore itself is WION's political editor Karthikeya Sharma, who's been tracking all these developments for us there in Singapore. Karthikeya, good to see you there in Singapore. It looks like the Prime Minister, of course, has had an action-packed last couple of days, but the fact that he's interacting with young people on technology innovations just goes to show that it's not just about bilateral talks with the who's who's, but also of what's happening on the ground.
Absolutely, Aisha. Absolutely. I agree with you. And the look east, or the act east, and the fact that he's going to give a keynote address at a time when he has had 3 bilaterals, Sochi, Wuhan, and the one short one at Shanti Niketan. So, you know, the talk is as to what he's going to say. But on this issue, I'm joined by the associate editor of the Straits Times, senior journalist Ravi Vellore on this. To begin with, what are the expectations from the speech of the Prime Minister? Keeping in mind that he had those bilaterals with Putin, the Chinese Premier and Sheikh Hasina.
Well, I think Singapore and much of this region would really like to know essentially, you know, what India thinks of this whole Indo-Pacific concept. You might be aware, Karthikeya, that on his way down to Singapore, U.S. Defense Secretary Matters stopped in Hawaii, and there he renamed the Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command. I'm not sure if you people have taken note of it.
Yes.
Yeah, all this is playing to India in a sense, and there have been a lot of movements in this region. I think you mentioned Wuhan and Sochi. But I'd like to also point out that he's just come from Jakarta, Indonesia. And I think that was a very significant visit, because if you read the joint statement that came out of it, talk about you know, freedom of navigation, respect for international law, UNCLOS, there's so much common ground there, and for a common maritime vision. These things actually are watched very closely in Southeast Asia, and we'd like to know what the Indian Prime Minister thinks of all this put together from an Indian point of view. You had the 10 ASEAN heads of state in New Delhi in January, which was quite a diplomatic coup. We had, in Southeast Asia, we had senior leaders, whether it's Prime Minister, President or Vice President. Every ASEAN country since Mr. Modi took charge in 2014 May has had a big Indian visit. So there's a lot of movement. We see some picking up of the pace. Most of us in Southeast Asia would like to see a bigger Indian presence, you know, and I think the nice thing about the Indian thing is that nobody feels insecure about India coming in, and that is a very big positive for Indian diplomacy. I think they've done a very good job. And now we'd like to hear more from the Prime Minister himself, because as you know, Singapore has been inviting Mr. Modi to the Shangri-La since he took charge. And we are really glad that he accepted this time, and we expect to hear something significant from him.
But there's a difference this time around. You know, if you look at the history, it's always been the West Asia, the South Asia which has been boil, or even the Central Asia. But this time around, you have the Southeast Asia which is on boil. You have anxiety on part of Vietnam, you have anxiety on part of Indonesia, in context of the South China Sea and the muscular approach which China has. And then you have the Kim-Trump, the conversation which continues round and round and round. So do you feel that it's going to have its own imprint on this summit?
Well, you know, I must say that this is a very exciting month for diplomacy in Southeast Asia, particularly in Singapore, because right after this big summit, and this is a big one, by the way, 2018 we had 600 delegates from 40 countries. And for the first time we had a very high, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO is here. So this is a big Shangri-La. And right after the Shangri-La, we are going into the summit, if it happens, between Kim and Trump. It is a very busy time for diplomacy. And for Singapore particularly, we're quite pleased to be right in the center of it, and we'd like to see what we can do to contribute in whatever way we can.
And lastly, before I let go of you, what do you make of the Prime Minister's visit to Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Jakarta and Singapore?
I think he had an excellent visit to Indonesia. You might be aware, Kartikeya, that in the 50s there was a time when Sukarno's Indonesia actually wanted Indian Ocean to be renamed the Indonesian Ocean. In 1985, when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister of India, India actually had a plan to put down Jaguar fighter bombers in Car Nicobar Air Base. They pulled back from that decision. Maybe it was a good thing to do, because at that point they thought that Southeast Asia might be alarmed if too much of an Indian military presence was right at their doorstep in the Andaman Islands. But today, India is going ahead with, beefing up the Andamans in a very significant way, and I don't think you see much worry in Southeast Asia about that at all, and that I think is a good thing for India.
So, Aisha, another 15 minutes to go, and then we'll know what Prime Minister thinks of the issues related to now Indo-Pacific, what are the challenges, and what is his vision about those challenges as to how they can be sorted out. But I really don't think that one can expect any component of the speech to make a huge headline in context of taking an antagonistic position, because I don't think it's going to happen in the wake of the three meetings, one-to-one meetings he had. But yes, I do expect him to talk about the right to free navigation in rule-based system.
Absolutely, and I suppose India is going to be front and center in terms of the Prime Minister's speech. India first, but acting east. We leave it at that. Kartikeya, thanks very much for that perspective from you and your guest there in Singapore. We'll get back to you once the speech is underway. But speaking of the Indian Prime Minister, he presented his Singaporean counterpart, Lee Hsien Loong, with a cultural and historical gift in the form of a replica of the 6th century Buddha Gupta stele. It bears the Sanskrit phrases in the Pallava script and serves as an important evidence of the transmission of Buddhism from India to Southeast Asia. The relic originally belonged to the Buddhist community, which was residing in the Malay Peninsula. The community was known to receive patronage from Indian merchants. As history goes, it was discovered by a Lieutenant Colonel James Lowe of the East India Company in Kedah in the present-day Malaysia. Also happens to be the state in which the current Prime Minister of Malaysia was born. But this discovery was made in the year 1834. The original relic is currently housed at the Indian Museum in the eastern Indian city of Kolkata.